Back in the 17th century, a whole kingdom literally tore itself in two. We call it the English Revolution, but it wasn't just a war. It was this massive seismic event that ended with a king getting his head chopped off, the church being totally dismantled, and it completely reshaped the idea of what a nation could even be. It really did set the stage for modern democracy and capitalism. But the big question is, how on earth did it happen?
Okay, let's really get into this, because that's the question at the heart of it all. It's a question that honestly never goes away. It was as relevant in the 1640s as it is today. And to wrap our heads around this incredible collapse, we're going to look at it through the eyes of two absolute giants of history who gave us two profoundly different answers.
So, in one corner, you've got Christopher Hill. He's this brilliant Marxist historian who looked at the whole thing and saw an inevitable clash of economic classes. And in the other corner, you have Lawrence Stone, a liberal thinker who saw it as the chaotic, almost accidental collapse of a totally dysfunctional government. Two incredibly smart guys, one single event, and two completely different stories.
Now, before we can get into their debate, we first have to picture the world they were talking about. This is early modern England, and it's basically a pressure cooker of political, economic, and religious tension just waiting to explode. Think of it like a really, really long fuse. It was first lit way back in 1485 when the Tudor dynasty got started. Then it got a whole lot shorter and burned a lot hotter thanks to the religious chaos of the Reformation. And by the time the Stuart family took the throne in 1603, that fuse was burning dangerously close to the powder keg, which, finally blew up in 1642.
And this is the key thing. This wasn't just one problem. It was like a three-front war of ideas happening all at once. Politically, you had this huge fight. Who really gets the final say, the king or the parliament? Economically, you had the old, creaky feudal system clashing with this dynamic, new force of capitalism. And then, religiously, you had these passionate, fiery Puritans challenging the authority of the official, state-run church. England was basically a society at war with itself.
All right, let's jump into Christopher Hill's argument and see how he puts all those pieces together. For him, the answer was crystal clear and incredibly powerful. This was a class war, plain and simple. Hill called this a bourgeois revolution. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, for him, this wasn't some random rebellion. He argued that a new, ambitious class of people, merchants, modernizing landowners, entrepreneurs, the bourgeoisie, had become the real economic engine of the country. The problem was, the political system, the old feudal state run by the king and his cronies, was holding them back. For Hill, the logic here was almost like a law of physics. Step 1, the economy changes, and this new, powerful class emerges. Step 2, the old government, with its ancient rules and special privileges for the old guard, becomes a giant roadblock. So, what's the inevitable final step? The new class uses Parliament as its weapon to smash that roadblock and seize control for itself. This quote, it just cuts right to the heart of his entire idea. Hill basically brushed past all the fancy talk about religion and liberty and made this one stark claim. Underneath it all, this was a fight about who controlled the money, the land, and the economic future of England. It was a struggle for property. But was it really that simple? Was it that neat? Let's bring in Lawrence Stone, who looked at the very same facts and saw something totally different. Not a clean class struggle, but a messy, chaotic, and frankly, avoidable government collapse. Stone just didn't buy the idea of one unified rising class fighting one decaying one. He looked at the elites and saw them as fractured and fighting amongst themselves. For him, the problem wasn't a rising class, it was a failing state. He called it a crisis of the regime, brought on by what he famously termed multiple dysfunctions. So Stone broke down the road to war into these three distinct stages. First, you had the long-term preconditions. These were the deep cracks in the foundation of the state that had been growing for over a century. Then you had the precipitators, a decade of just awful policy mistakes by the king. And finally, you get the triggers, the short-term sparks that finally lit the whole thing up. Let's look at those preconditions for a second. The crown was actually pretty weak. It didn't have a real professional army or an effective civil service. The old aristocracy was losing its grip, while this ambitious gentry class was gaining power and respect. And all the while, Puritanism was spreading these radical ideas about challenging authority. You put all that together, and you get a massive crisis of confidence. People just stop believing in the folks in charge. And right here,
This is the crucial difference between him and Hill. For Stone, this whole collapse was not inevitable. Yeah, the state was fragile, for sure, but he argued it took the absolutely disastrous decisions of King Charles I and his ministers to push it over the edge. In his view, a series of catastrophic blunders and pure stubbornness turned a crisis into a war. A different, smarter king might have avoided the whole thing.
Okay, so we've got two incredibly powerful but very different explanations. Hill's revolution is like an unstoppable economic tide. Stone's is a preventable political train wreck. So, which one's right? I mean, look at them side by side. The differences are just so clear. For Hill, the main driver is class conflict. The key players are this rising capitalist class, and the whole thing was pretty much bound to happen. For Stone, the driver is a crisis in government. The players are these fractured, bickering elites, and the war was absolutely avoidable. They're on completely different pages. But here's the twist. Years later, after decades of academic battle, Stone himself looked back on it all and found some really surprising common ground. He wrote that while he and Hill would probably never agree on the causes, they did agree on one massive thing. The outcome of the war was truly revolutionary. It was, in his own words, decisive.
And that really gets to the whole point of what we're talking about here. The story of the English Revolution isn't just Hill's story, and it isn't just Stone's story. Understanding history means understanding that it's an ongoing debate. The lens you use, whether it's Marxist economics or liberal politics, completely changes the story you see.
So, we're left with this one big final question. When you see two brilliant minds look at the very same event and draw such different conclusions about what happened 400 years ago, well, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? How can we possibly hope to make sense of the incredibly complex forces that are shaping our own world right now? It's a challenge that makes digging into history like this more important than ever.